Khabib Nurmagomedov walks into an empty gym before sunrise. No cameras, no crowd, just the sound of his own breathing and the echo of mats being struck by bare feet. Somewhere on a wall behind him hangs a photograph of a man in a papaka, the traditional hat of Dagestan, his father. The gym is quiet, but the silence carries weight, the kind of weight that comes from a promise kept at enormous cost. Because this is the man who walked away from the sport he ruled completely, at the very peak of his power, undefeated in 29 fights, and never looked back. Why would anyone do that? Why would a man leave everything? The money, the fame, the chance to chase an even bigger legacy. The moment he had finally reached the top. The answer, as we'll discover, isn't about fighting at all. It's about a promise made to a grieving mother, a debt owed to a father who was no longer alive to collect it, and a code of honor that most of the modern world has forgotten how to understand. This is the story of Khabib Nurmagomedov, a man who became a legend not despite his restraint, but because of it. To understand why millions of people across the world still talk about this man years after his last fight, you have to understand that Khabib was never just an athlete. He became a symbol. To some, he represents discipline in an age of impulsiveness. To others, he represents a clash of cultures, East versus West, tradition versus spectacle, faith versus fame. His name still trends today, not because of a title defense, but because of what he says, who he supports, and the quiet influence he wields over the sport he left behind. By the end of this documentary, you will understand not just what Khabib Nurmagomedov achieved inside a cage, but why his choices outside of it may end up mattering even more. Khabib Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov was born in 1988 in the small Dagestani village of Sildi, high in the mountains of the Russian Caucasus, in a place where winters are brutal, and life is built around toughness. His family soon moved to the town of Kizlyar, but the mountains never left him. His father, Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, was a decorated Soviet-era combat sambo champion and a respected community figure, and he had one plan for his son from the very beginning: to forge him, deliberately and relentlessly, into an unbeatable fighter. The methods were extreme, even by wrestling family standards. There are stories, some verified by Khabib himself in interviews, of a young Khabib training in freezing rivers, running through snow, and, in a story that has become almost mythical online, wrestling a bear cub as a child, a claim that has circulated widely, but which even Khabib has treated with amusement rather than firm confirmation. What is verified is far less theatrical, but arguably more remarkable: a childhood built entirely around discipline, prayer, and combat sport, with almost no separation between the three. His early life was not glamorous. Dagestan in the 1990s was a poor, unstable region, scarred by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the violence spilling over from nearby Chechnya. There were no billion-dollar sponsorships waiting for a boy from Kizlyar. There was only a small gym, a demanding father, and a religious upbringing rooted in Islam that would come to define nearly every public statement Khabib would ever make. He has spoken about how his father used to make him train with older, more experienced fighters, forcing him to lose over and over so that failure would stop meaning something to fear. That single detail explains almost everything that came later. By the time most fighters are discovering the sport for the first time, Khabib had already spent over a decade being broken down and rebuilt by a man who believed suffering was the only real teacher. And somewhere in that grinding, unglamorous process, a fighter was being built who the world would eventually consider unbeatable. When Khabib entered professional mixed martial arts, he did something that seemed almost impossible in a sport built on constant risk. He simply did not lose. Fight after fight, he dismantled opponents not with knockout power alone, but with a suffocating wrestling and grappling style that made opposing fighters feel like they were drowning on dry land. He signed with the UFC in 2012, and by the time he captured the UFC lightweight championship in 2018 by defeating Ali Aquinta, he had already built a reputation as one of the most dominant grapplers the sport had ever produced. But it was what happened next that turned Khabib from a champion into a global phenomenon. In October 2018, Khabib fought Conor McGregor, at the time, the biggest star in combat sports, in a bout that transcended MMA entirely. It wasn't just a fight, it was a cultural collision. McGregor had spent months mocking Khabib's religion, his father, and his country in an aggressive promotional campaign designed to sell pay-per-views. Khabib won the fight by submission in the 4th round. And then, the moment that would define his career in the public imagination happened. He leapt over the cage and charged into the crowd, going after a member of McGregor's team who had allegedly provoked him with insults about his faith and his father. Chaos erupted. It was one of the most replayed, dissected, and debated moments in UFC history. Was it a lapse of discipline from the most disciplined fighter alive? Or was it a man defending something he considered more sacred than any championship belt? Verified reports confirm Khabib was fined and suspended by athletic commissions for the incident. But rather than damaging his reputation, the brawl seemed to deepen the loyalty of his fanbase, particularly across the Muslim world and Russia, where he was seen as someone who refused to let disrespect toward his religion and family go unanswered. Then, in July 2020, tragedy struck. Khabib's father and lifelong coach, Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, died from complications related to COVID-19. It is difficult to overstate how central this man was to Khabib's identity, not just as a coach, but as the architect of his entire existence as a fighter. Weeks later, at UFC 254, Khabib defended his title against Justin Gaethje, submitting him in the 2nd round to improve his record to a perfect 29-0. Then, still on the canvas, tears streaming down his face, he announced his retirement in front of a stunned arena. "I want to tell you, this was my last fight," he said, explaining that he had promised his mother, days after his father's death, that he would not fight again without him in his corner. No rematch offers, no financial incentive, and there were enormous ones, including a reported 9-figure proposal to face Floyd Mayweather, have ever been enough to change his mind. That single decision, made in a moment of raw grief, is arguably the most consequential choice of his entire career, because it transformed him from a great champion into something rarer, an athlete who proved, publicly and permanently, that some things matter more than money or legacy. This is where the story of Khabib Nurmagomedov shifts from a sports narrative into something closer to a cultural mission, because Khabib did not disappear after retirement. He transformed himself, deliberately, into a builder of other champions. He founded the Eagle Fighting Championship, a promotion designed to give fighters from the Caucasus region a platform they previously lacked. He became the head of a coaching operation in Dagestan that has since produced a striking, almost unbelievable pipeline of UFC champions and contenders, including his own cousins Umar and Usman Nurmagomedov, and, most significantly, Islam Makhachev, who inherited Khabib's lightweight throne and has been widely regarded as his direct successor in both style and dominance. Reports throughout 2026 confirm Khabib remains a constant, hands-on presence at major UFC events, coaching cage-side even though, by his own admission, the transition from fighter to coach has been uncomfortable for him. "When I'm coaching, I can only give advice," he said at a recent World Sports Summit appearance. "I cannot use my hands, my body. This part, I don't really like, honestly." It's a small but revealing confession from a man who spent his entire life solving problems with physical dominance, and who now has to trust other people's bodies to finish what he started. So what is the real conflict surrounding Khabib today, years after his retirement? It isn't a courtroom battle or a hunger strike. Despite what some might expect from a documentary framed around controversy, no verified reports place Khabib Nurmagomedov at the center of any ongoing protest, legal case, or hunger strike as of mid-2026. What exists instead is something quieter but no less significant. A persistent tension between the myth of Khabib as an untouchable symbol and the reality of Khabib as a public figure whose every statement is now scrutinized, dissected, and sometimes weaponized by people on opposing sides of political and cultural debates. In 2026 alone, he was dragged into public disputes multiple times, denying claims made by rival fighter Arman Tsarukyan that Russian President Vladimir Putin had personally funded a gym for him, clashing publicly with UFC President Dana White over comments regarding his retirement, and sparking heated online debate after sharing social media posts that appeared to touch on the Israel-Palestine conflict around the time of the FIFA World Cup final. None of these moments involve legal jeopardy, but together, they reveal a man who can no longer simply exist as a retired athlete. Every opinion he shares, however small, ripples outward into geopolitics, religion, and national pride. This is the price of the platform he built. When Khabib speaks, Dagestan speaks. When Khabib takes a side, millions of fans across Russia, the Muslim world, and the international MMA community react. His comments on gender and combat sports, including recent remarks suggesting that men are inherently physically stronger than women in the context of fighting, drew significant backlash from segments of the sports media, while others defended the comments as a blunt but honest athletic assessment rather than an attack. Disputes like these are unresolved and, frankly, unresolvable in a way that satisfies everyone. What's undeniable is the pattern. Every time Khabib opens his mouth publicly, it becomes a headline, whether the topic is football predictions, geopolitics, or the sport he supposedly left behind. There are also personal risks that rarely make it into typical sports coverage. Khabib has spoken about the psychological toll of stepping away from active competition, the strange emptiness of transitioning from a man who solved his problems with his own body to a man who can only coach from the sidelines. There is also the enormous responsibility now resting on his shoulders as the de facto leader of an entire generation of Dagestani fighters. Every young athlete who walks into his gym is, in some sense, inheriting a piece of the legacy his father built and Khabib carried across the finish line. If any of them falter, if any of them embarrass that legacy, the weight of that failure would land, at least partially, on Khabib himself. That is not a hunger strike or a legal battle, but it is its own kind of pressure, quieter, longer, and arguably harder to escape. Why should any of this matter to someone who has never watched a single UFC fight? Because Khabib Nurmagomedov's story is really a story about what happens when tradition collides with modern fame. He is a man shaped by mountain villages and Soviet-era hardship who became one of the most recognized faces on the planet. And instead of assimilating into the Western sports entertainment machine that made him rich, he pulled that machine toward his own values, religion, family, restraint, promise-keeping. For millions of young men across Russia, the Caucasus, and the broader Muslim world, Khabib represents proof that you don't have to abandon where you came from in order to conquer the biggest stage in the world. That is a message with implications far beyond sports, touching questions of identity, faith, and what success is actually supposed to look like. Now for a few things about Khabib that even dedicated fans often don't know. Despite being one of the greatest grapplers in MMA history, he has openly stated he never really considered himself the most talented athlete on a purely physical level. He believed his advantage was built entirely through relentless repetition and suffering, not natural gift. Despite retiring in 2020, verified reporting indicates he seriously considered a complete departure from MMA altogether at one point, planning to focus entirely on his family and outside business ventures before ultimately settling into the coaching role that now defines his post-fighting life. He was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame in 2022, an honor almost unheard of for someone who retired so recently and fought so few times compared to other legends. And in a detail that surprises many, Khabib has continued making headlines completely outside of combat sports, offering detailed predictions about global football tournaments, weighing in on international politics, and drawing headlines for a viral Instagram tribute to football icon Diego Maradona, proof that his cultural footprint now extends into arenas that have nothing to do with fighting at all. So where does that leave the story of Khabib Nurmagomedov today? He is not currently at the center of a legal battle. He is not staging a hunger strike. He is not fighting for his freedom in any courtroom. What he is doing, quietly and deliberately, is managing a legacy so large that almost anything he says becomes a global talking point, and carrying forward a promise made to his mother in the rawest moment of grief a son can experience. He has spent years proving that walking away, at the exact height of power, can be its own form of victory. Whether you see him as a devoted son honoring his father's memory, a cultural icon navigating an increasingly polarized world, or a man whose blunt opinions occasionally spark controversy he perhaps didn't intend, one thing remains true. Khabib Nurmagomedov never needed to fight again to remain one of the most talked about men in sports. The gym is quiet now. The mats are empty. But somewhere in Dagestan, another young fighter is being shaped in that same unglamorous, relentless tradition. carrying forward a legacy that Khabib himself once inherited from a father who never got to see just how far his promise would travel. And perhaps that's the real ending to this story. Not a final fight, not a final verdict, but a promise still being kept, one quiet morning at a time.